It's been over 25 years since I stood at Mama's grave with that folded flag in my hands, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Sometimes I wonder how I survived what came next. This is what happened, and why I'll never forget it. The funeral flowers were still fresh on Mama's grave when I felt my phone buzz in my coat pocket. Afghanistan had hardened me to expect the worst, but nothing, not roadside bombs, not losing brothers in arms, had prepared me for the subject line that would shatter what was left of my world. We need to talk. It's over. 23 years of marriage reduced to a Gmail notification while I stood there, still holding the folded flag they'd given me for Mama's service. I stared at that screen until the words blurred, my dress uniform suddenly feeling like a costume I had no right to wear. The email was clinical, efficient, like Sandra was filing a report instead of ending our life together. No mention of the deployment that had kept me away for 8 months. No acknowledgement that I'd just buried the woman who raised me alone after Daddy died in Vietnam. Just 3 paragraphs of legal language and a request that I make this easy for both of us. The cemetery was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic, and I found myself wondering if this was how Daddy felt when he got that Dear John letter in Da Nang. Mama never told me the details, but I remember her burning those letters in the backyard, the smoke curling up like prayers she couldn't quite form. Standing there with dirt still under my fingernails from throwing that first handful of earth, I realized I was about to understand heartbreak in a way I'd never wanted to learn. I read that email 3 times before the words actually sank in, standing there between rows of headstones like some kind of broken soldier. The morning sun was cutting through the oak trees, casting long shadows across Mama's fresh grave, and I kept thinking about how she'd always said Sandra was too pretty to be trusted. 23 years of marriage, and my wife couldn't even wait until I got home from burying my mother to tell me she was done. The flag in my hands felt heavier than any equipment I'd carried in combat, and I wondered if this was what defeat actually felt like. Sandra's email was typed with the same precision she used for everything else. Every comma in place, every sentence calculated to minimize her guilt while maximizing my confusion. She mentioned irreconcilable differences and growing apart, but nothing about the phone calls that had gotten shorter and colder over the past 4 months. Nothing about how she'd stopped sending care packages or how her voice had changed when she talked to me, becoming distant in a way that made me wonder if I was talking to a stranger. The email was signed "Best Regards, Sandra," like I was some business acquaintance instead of the man who'd held her hand through 3 miscarriages. My phone kept buzzing with condolence texts from friends and family, but I couldn't focus on anything except those 3 paragraphs that had just destroyed what was left of my world. I walked to my rental car in a daze, my dress blues feeling like they belonged to someone else, someone who still had a home to go back to. The parking lot was empty except for the funeral director's hearse. And I sat there in the driver's seat, staring at that email until the words started to blur together. I thought about calling her, demanding an explanation, but something in the cold efficiency of her words told me she'd already made her choice. The drive back to the hotel felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life, my mind racing between memories of Mama's funeral and the reality of what Sandra had just done. I kept checking my phone, hoping for another message, maybe an apology or an explanation that would make this make sense, but there was nothing. Just that one email that had managed to turn the worst day of my life into something even more unbearable. The hotel room was exactly as I'd left it, my uniform hanging in the closet, my flight home scheduled for the next morning. But everything felt different now. When I finally worked up the courage to call her, the phone went straight to voicemail, and I realized she'd probably blocked my number. 23 years of marriage, and she couldn't even give me the courtesy of a conversation. I sat there on the edge of that hotel bed, still in my dress uniform, wondering how someone could be so heartless. But what I discovered when I got home the next day would prove that Sandra's cruelty had depths I'd never imagined. If you've ever felt like your whole world was crumbling while everyone else just moved on with their lives, stay with me. I need to tell you what happened next, and maybe you'll understand why I had to share this story. The key still fit in the lock, but the house didn't feel like home anymore. I could tell something was wrong before I even stepped through the front door. The silence was different, thicker, like the air had been sucked out of the place. Sandra's car wasn't in the driveway, but that didn't surprise me since she'd made it clear she didn't want to face me. What did surprise me was how empty everything felt, not just emotionally, but physically. Like someone had hollowed out the life we'd built together and left behind only the shell. The smell was wrong too. No trace of her perfume, no lingering scent of the lavender candle she always burned in the evenings. I walked through our living room like a man exploring a crime scene, noticing little details that added up to something bigger and more devastating than I'd expected. The family photos were gone from the mantelpiece. Not just the ones of us together, but even the pictures of my deployment, Mama's last birthday, the vacation we'd taken to Colorado before I left. Her books were missing from the shelves, her reading chair was gone, and even the throw pillows she'd insisted on buying were nowhere to be found. It was like she'd tried to erase every trace of herself from the house, leaving behind only the furniture that had come with me into the marriage. The kitchen was where the reality really hit me. The coffee maker was gone, the expensive one she'd bought for Christmas 2 years ago, the one she'd said would make our mornings better when I got back from deployment. Her favorite mug wasn't in the cabinet, and neither were the fancy plates her mother had given us for our anniversary. The refrigerator was practically empty, except for a few condiments and a 6-pack of beer that had probably been there since before I deployed. It felt like walking through a museum exhibit of a life that had been carefully dismantled, piece by piece, while I was 7,000 miles away. The bedroom was the worst part. Her side of the closet was completely empty, not even a forgotten shoe or a lonely hanger left behind. The jewelry box I'd given her for our 10th anniversary was gone, along with the antique mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. Even the sheets were different, cheap ones from Walmart, instead of the Egyptian cotton set we'd picked out together. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my travel clothes, and realized she'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. This wasn't a sudden decision made in the heat of emotion. This was a calculated extraction, planned and executed with military precision. I was still trying to process the emptiness when I heard footsteps on the porch, and for a moment my heart jumped with the impossible hope that maybe she'd come back to explain. But what I saw when I looked out the window wasn't Sandra at all. It was a man I'd never seen before, and he was carrying boxes toward the front door like he belonged there. My blood turned to ice as I realized that my wife hadn't just left me. She'd already found someone to replace me. The man on my porch was younger than me, maybe 35, with the kind of confident stride that comes from never having to duck bullets or carry a friend's body to safety. He was carrying a box of kitchen supplies. I could see the corner of a coffee maker sticking out, the same expensive one that had been missing from my kitchen counter. My hands were shaking as I watched him fish around in his pocket for what I somehow knew would be a key to my own front door. The key that Sandra had obviously given him. The key that gave him access to the house I'd been paying for while I was deployed overseas, fighting for freedoms he'd probably never had to think about. I yanked the door open before he could use that key, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been going on. He didn't look surprised to see me, just uncomfortable, like he'd been dreading this moment but knew it was inevitable. "You must be David," he said, and the casual way he said my name made my stomach turn. This wasn't some stranger Sandra had just met. This was someone who'd been hearing about me, probably laughing about me, while I was sending love letters from Afghanistan. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that probably worked well on lonely wives whose husbands were serving their country. "And you must be the reason my wife filed for divorce while I was burying my mother," I replied, keeping my voice level, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to knock him off my porch. He had the decency to look ashamed for about half a second before his face hardened into something that resembled defiance. Sandra said, "You'd probably be hostile about this," he said, like I was being unreasonable for objecting to finding another man moving into my house. She thought it would be better if we talked like adults. Adults, like there was something mature about sleeping with another man's wife while he was deployed. Like there was something sophisticated about destroying a marriage through email. The box in his hands was getting heavier, and I could see him shifting his weight from foot to foot, probably calculating whether he could push past me or if he needed to wait for me to step aside. But I wasn't moving, and I wasn't going to make this easy for him. "How long?" I asked, and he had the nerve to look confused, like he didn't understand the question. "How long have you been sleeping with my wife?" The words came out harsher than I'd intended. But I was past caring about politeness. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might actually try to lie to me, but then he seemed to remember that the evidence was literally in his hands. 6 months, he said, and the number hit me like a physical blow. 6 months, which meant this had started almost immediately after I'd deployed, while I was still sending her letters about how much I missed her. 6 months of phone calls where she'd pretended to love me while she was planning a life with someone else. 6 months of care packages she'd never sent, of emails that got shorter and colder, of a marriage that was already over while I was still fighting to stay alive so I could come home to her. But as devastating as that number was, it was nothing compared to what I was about to discover about what else Sandra had been doing while I was gone. I let him keep standing there with his box while I went straight to the computer, my hands trembling as I logged into our joint checking account for the first time in 3 months. The screen took forever to load, and when it finally did, I had to blink several times to make sure I was reading the numbers correctly. Our account balance was $17.43. $17 out of the $26,812 that had been there when I'd last checked in February. I scrolled through the transaction history with a growing sense of horror, watching months of my combat pay disappear into cash withdrawals, transfers, and purchases I'd never authorized. The withdrawals were systematic, methodical, never more than $500 at a time, spaced out over weeks to avoid triggering any fraud alerts. Sandra had been bleeding our account dry while I was sending her love letters from Kandahar, taking my hazard pay and using it to finance her new life with the man who was still standing on my porch. There were charges to furniture stores, electronics retailers, and even a jewelry store, probably buying gifts for her boyfriend with money I'd earned by dodging mortars. The most recent withdrawal was dated 3 days ago, the same day I'd flown home for Mama's funeral, like she'd been waiting for me to be at my most vulnerable. But the joint checking account was just the beginning. I clicked over to our savings account, the one where we'd been putting money away for a down payment on a bigger house when I got back from deployment. That account was completely empty. $34,206 gone, transferred out in 2 large chunks over the past month. The timing was perfect, almost artistic in its cruelty. She'd cleaned out our life savings while I was arranging Mama's funeral, while I was dealing with the Army's bureaucracy and trying to get emergency leave approved. She'd known exactly when I'd be too distracted to check the accounts. I could hear voices outside. Sandra's boyfriend was apparently on the phone with someone, probably her, telling her that I was home and that their plan to move his stuff in while I was gone had been interrupted. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Not only had she stolen my money, but she'd planned to move him into my house before I even got back. I thought about the cheap sheets on the bed, the empty refrigerator, the missing coffee maker, and realized she'd been systematically stripping the house of anything valuable while making sure I'd come home to nothing. It was like she'd been planning the perfect crime, except her victim was the man who'd married her, loved her, and trusted her with everything. The final blow came when I checked the account where Mama's life insurance money had been deposited. $22,934, money that was supposed to help me pay for her burial expenses, money that represented the last thing Mama had been able to give me. Gone. transferred out yesterday, the day of the funeral, while I was standing over her grave reading Sandra's divorce email. The sheer vindictiveness of it took my breath away, and I realized that the woman I'd married had become someone capable of cruelties I'd never imagined. But there was one more discovery waiting for me, one that would make everything else look like small-time theft. The phone call came 20 minutes after I'd discovered the empty accounts, and the voice on the other end was cheerful, professional, completely oblivious to the nightmare she was about to reveal. "Hi, this is Jennifer from Morrison Real Estate, calling to confirm the showing scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. I have several interested buyers, and I just wanted to make sure you and Sandra would both be available for any questions they might have." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, and I had to ask her to repeat herself. Certain I'd misunderstood, but I hadn't misunderstood anything. My wife had put our house on the market without telling me, and apparently she'd been showing it to potential buyers while I was deployed. Jennifer's voice got more uncertain as she realized something was wrong. "I'm sorry, I thought you were both aware of the listing. Sandra signed all the paperwork last month, and we've had quite a bit of interest. She said you were deployed, but that you'd signed a power of attorney, allowing her to handle the sale." I felt my knees go weak as the full scope of Sandra's betrayal became clear. The power of attorney was real. I'd signed it before deploying, thinking it would help her handle any emergencies while I was gone. I'd never imagined she'd use it to sell our house, our home, the place where we'd planned to start our family, the place where I'd been counting the days until I could return. The listing was already active online, complete with professional photos that had obviously been taken weeks ago. Sandra had staged the house perfectly, removing all traces of our life together and making it look like a showplace instead of the home where we'd spent 7 years of marriage. The photos showed rooms I barely recognized. Everything personal had been removed, replaced with generic decorations that made the place look like a hotel. She'd even hired a professional photographer, using my money to market the sale of my own house. The asking price was $328,000, and according to Jennifer, they already had 2 offers. I walked through the house again, this time seeing it through the eyes of potential buyers instead of a betrayed husband. The missing furniture, the empty walls, the generic decorations. It all made perfect sense now. Sandra hadn't just been erasing her presence from the house. She'd been preparing it for sale, getting it ready to be someone else's home. The man on the porch, the one with the key, probably wasn't just her boyfriend. He was probably her business partner in this scheme, helping her liquidate everything we'd built together so they could start fresh somewhere else with my money. The most devastating part was the timeline. Jennifer mentioned that the listing had been active for 3 weeks, which meant Sandra had been showing our house to strangers while I was writing her letters about how much I missed her, how much I was looking forward to coming home. Potential buyers had been walking through our bedroom, our kitchen, our living room, imagining their own lives in the space where I'd been dreaming of rebuilding mine. But the cruelest irony was still to come. I was about to discover that Sandra's betrayal had one final twist that would make everything else look like mere preparation. The certified letter was waiting for me when I got back from confronting the real estate agent, and the return address told me everything I needed to know about how long Sandra had been planning this. Henderson, Martinez and Associates, the most expensive divorce firm in the county. The kind of lawyers who specialized in taking cheating spouses to the cleaners. Except in this case, I was the one being positioned as the cheating spouse, and Sandra was the innocent victim. The letter was dated 2 weeks ago, which meant it had been sitting here while I was in Afghanistan, probably delivered the same day I was writing her what turned out to be my last love letter. The papers inside were a masterpiece of legal manipulation, 57 pages of carefully crafted lies designed to make me look like an abusive, unfaithful husband who'd abandoned his wife to go play soldier overseas. According to Sandra's version of events, I'd been emotionally distant throughout our marriage, had refused to have children out of selfishness, and had been having an affair with a fellow soldier, a complete fiction that was apparently based on a single photo of me with Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a married officer whose only crime was being in the same unit as me. The narrative was so detailed, so convincing, that for a moment I wondered if Sandra actually believed her own lies or if she was just that good at manipulation. The financial demands were staggering. Sandra wanted half of everything, including half of my military retirement benefits, half of Mama's life insurance money, and half the proceeds from the sale of the house. But more than that, she wanted alimony, permanent alimony, based on the claim that she'd sacrificed her career to support my military service. The truth was that Sandra had never had a career to sacrifice. She'd worked part-time at a boutique before we got married and had quit because she said she didn't like the hours. But according to her lawyers, she'd been a devoted military wife who'd put her own dreams on hold to support my selfish ambitions. The restraining order was the cruelest touch. Sandra had filed a petition claiming that I'd been physically and emotionally abusive, that she was afraid of what I might do when I returned from deployment. The order prohibited me from contacting her, from going to her workplace, from even entering certain parts of town where she might be. It was a preemptive strike, designed to make me look like a dangerous man who needed to be controlled by the courts. The fact that I'd never raised my voice to her, much less my hand, didn't matter. The order was temporary, but it would stay on my record forever, a permanent reminder of how thoroughly she'd managed to destroy my reputation. The final page was a motion for an emergency hearing, scheduled for the day after tomorrow. Sandra's lawyers were asking for temporary custody of all our assets, temporary alimony and temporary attorney's fees, all based on the claim that I was a flight risk who might try to hide money or intimidate witnesses. The hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning, and I realized that Sandra had timed everything perfectly. She'd known exactly when I'd be getting home, exactly when I'd be discovering the empty accounts and the real estate listing. She'd orchestrated this entire nightmare to catch me at my most vulnerable, when I was still grieving Mama's death and trying to process the end of my marriage. But what I didn't know was that Sandra had one more surprise waiting for me, one that would make everything else look like child's play. I keep wondering, when someone you love turns into someone you don't recognize, how do you even begin to fight back? Have you ever felt like the whole system was designed to destroy you? I'd love to know if anyone else has been through something like this. I showed up to the hearing with a public defender who looked like she'd graduated from law school the week before, while Sandra had 3 lawyers in expensive suits sitting at her table. The courtroom was nearly empty, except for a few other cases waiting their turn. But I could see Sandra's boyfriend sitting in the back row, there to provide moral support for the woman who'd stolen my life. Sandra herself looked like she was auditioning for the role of grieving widow. Conservative dress, minimal makeup, tissues clutched in her hand like props in a performance designed to win the judge's sympathy. She didn't look at me once during the entire proceeding, which was probably a good thing because I wasn't sure I could have controlled my expression. Her lead attorney was a woman named Rebecca Martinez, and she laid out Sandra's case with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a loan shark. According to her narrative, I was a classic case of a military spouse who'd become increasingly violent and unstable over the course of multiple deployments. She had phone records showing that my calls to Sandra had become increasingly erratic and threatening, though she didn't mention that most of those calls had been me trying to figure out why Sandra was acting so distant. She had bank records showing that I'd been recklessly spending money on overseas purchases, though she didn't mention that most of those purchases had been gifts for Sandra or equipment I'd needed for my deployment. The most devastating part of her presentation was a recording of a phone call I'd made to Sandra 3 weeks ago, when I'd been trying to understand why she seemed so cold and distant. Martinez played a carefully edited version that made me sound angry and demanding, cutting out all the parts where I'd been pleading with Sandra to tell me what was wrong, where I'd been crying and begging her to help me understand why our marriage was falling apart. The recording made me sound like a controlling husband who was trying to manipulate his wife through guilt and threats, when the reality was that I'd been a desperate man trying to save his marriage without understanding that it was already over. The judge was a middle-aged man named Harrison, who'd probably seen 1,000 cases like this, and I could tell he was buying every word of Sandra's performance. When my public defender tried to present our side of the story, pointing out that there was no evidence of any actual abuse and that Sandra had been systematically emptying our accounts while I was deployed, Martinez objected on technical grounds that my lawyer wasn't prepared to counter. The whole thing felt like a rigged game. Like Sandra's team had been preparing for months while I was showing up to fight with a toy sword and a paper shield. Judge Harrison's ruling was swift and brutal. Sandra got temporary custody of all our assets, temporary alimony of $2,000 a month, and temporary attorney's fees that would probably bankrupt me before the case was over. I was ordered to stay away from Sandra, from the house, and from her workplace, and I was given 30 days to find somewhere else to live. The judge also ordered me to submit to a psychological evaluation, based on Sandra's claims that I was suffering from PTSD and might be a danger to myself or others. As I walked out of that courtroom, I felt like I'd been mugged by the legal system, but I was about to discover that Sandra's humiliation of me was just getting started. Dr. Rebecca Steinberg's office was in one of those medical complexes that smell like disinfectant and broken dreams, and I sat in the waiting room surrounded by pamphlets about depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The court had ordered me to undergo a psychological evaluation to determine whether I was fit to be around Sandra, and I knew that the results would play a major role in how our divorce settlement turned out. Sandra's lawyers had specifically requested Dr. Steinberg, and I was starting to understand that nothing about this process was going to be fair or impartial. The receptionist kept giving me nervous looks, like she'd been warned that I might be dangerous. The evaluation itself was 3 hours of carefully crafted questions designed to make me look unstable, and Dr. Steinberg had clearly been briefed on Sandra's version of events. She asked me about my anger issues, my control problems, and my inability to maintain healthy relationships, phrasing every question like she was confirming something that had already been established rather than exploring the truth. When I tried to explain that I'd never been violent or controlling, that Sandra had been the one who'd been lying and manipulating throughout our marriage, Dr. Steinberg would nod sympathetically and make notes about my tendency to blame others for my problems. The most frustrating part was the way she kept bringing up my military service, like being a soldier automatically made me a potential threat to society. She asked me about my experiences with violence, my exposure to trauma, and my difficulty adjusting to civilian life, all while taking notes that I was sure would be used against me in court. When I told her that I'd never been in direct combat, that my job had been mostly logistics and communications, she looked skeptical, like I was lying about my own military record. It was clear that she'd already made up her mind about me before I'd even walked into her office. The psychological tests were even worse. Hundreds of questions designed to catch me in contradictions and reveal hidden personality disorders. Questions like, do you sometimes feel that people are out to get you? And, have you ever felt like you wanted to hurt someone who had wronged you? Questions that were impossible to answer honestly without making yourself look paranoid or violent. I could see the trap in every question, but I also knew that being too careful with my answers would be seen as evidence that I was trying to manipulate the test. It was a no-win situation designed to produce the results that Sandra's lawyers wanted. The final report was 67 pages of professional-sounding psychological jargon that painted me as a damaged veteran with serious anger management issues and a tendency toward domestic violence. Dr. Steinberg recommended that I be required to attend anger management classes, undergo regular counseling, and be prohibited from possessing firearms. She also suggested that any future contact with Sandra should be supervised by a court-appointed mediator. The report was so damning that I knew it would follow me for the rest of my life, a permanent record of crimes I'd never committed and disorders I'd never had. But even as I was reading through Dr. Steinberg's character assassination, I was about to discover that Sandra had been working on something even more devastating. The knock on my hotel room door came at 11 o'clock at night, and I opened it to find two military police officers with expressions that told me my nightmare was about to get even worse. They were polite but firm, explaining that they were there to escort me to the base commander's office for questioning about allegations of conduct unbecoming an officer. The timing was perfect. Just as I was trying to fight Sandra's lies in civilian court, she'd managed to drag my military career into her web of deception. I knew, without being told, that she'd filed a complaint with my commanding officer, probably claiming that I'd been abusive or threatening, using my own chain of command to destroy what was left of my life. The drive to the base was silent, except for the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. I'd spent 15 years building my military career, earning the respect of my fellow soldiers and the trust of my superiors. I'd served 3 deployments, received commendations for my service, and had been in line for a promotion when I'd gotten emergency leave for Mama's funeral. Now I was sitting in the back of a military police vehicle, being treated like a criminal because my wife had decided to destroy my reputation, along with my marriage. The base looked different at night, more ominous, more like a prison than the place where I'd found purpose and brotherhood. Colonel Martinez was waiting for me in his office, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking Sandra's allegations. He had a file on his desk that was thicker than it should have been, and I could see copies of the restraining order, the psychological evaluation, and what looked like a formal complaint written in Sandra's handwriting. "Sergeant Morrison," he said, and the formality in his voice made my stomach drop. "I'm going to be direct with you. We've received some very serious allegations about your conduct, and I need to understand your side of the story before this goes any further." The allegations were even more detailed than what Sandra had told the civilian court. She'd accused me of threatening her over the phone, of stalking her through social media, and of making violent threats against her boyfriend. She'd provided evidence in the form of carefully edited text messages and phone records that made me look like a dangerous stalker who was using my military training to intimidate civilians. The most damaging allegation was that I'd been drinking heavily and making threats while in possession of military weapons, which was a court-martial offense that could end my career and land me in military prison. Colonel Martinez gave me 30 minutes to respond to the allegations, and I did my best to explain that Sandra was lying, that she'd been systematically destroying my life while I was deployed, that everything she'd told them was a carefully crafted fiction designed to make me look like a monster. But I could see in his eyes that he wasn't buying it, that Sandra's lies were more believable than my truth. He suspended me from duty pending a full investigation, confiscated my military ID, and warned me that I was facing a court-martial that could result in a dishonorable discharge and significant prison time. As I walked out of his office, I realized that Sandra had managed to destroy not just my marriage and my finances, but my entire identity as a soldier and a man. But the worst part was that I was about to discover she wasn't finished with me yet. I was sitting in a diner at 3 in the morning, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been completely destroyed when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was one I recognized, Jennifer from the real estate office, and she sounded panicked. "I'm so sorry to call you so late, but I just discovered something about your house sale that I think you need to know." I was going through the paperwork again, and I found some discrepancies in the power of attorney documentation. I think you need to get down here right away." Her voice was shaking, and I could tell that whatever she'd discovered was big enough to make her risk calling me in the middle of the night. The real estate office was dark, except for Jennifer's desk lamp, and she looked like she'd been crying. The paperwork was spread across her desk like evidence at a crime scene, and I could see immediately that something was wrong with the documents Sandra had provided. The power of attorney was legitimate. I'd signed it before deploying, but someone had altered it, adding language that gave Sandra authority to sell the house without my consent. The forgery was subtle but obvious once you knew what to look for, and Jennifer had only caught it because she'd been double-checking everything after my confused phone call earlier that day. But the forged power of attorney was just the beginning. Jennifer had also discovered that Sandra had been lying about our finances, inflating our debt and hiding our assets to make it look like we were in financial trouble and needed to sell the house quickly. She'd provided fake bank statements showing that we were behind on our mortgage payments, fake credit card bills showing massive debt, and even fake medical bills claiming that I'd been racking up psychiatric expenses. The entire narrative was a fiction designed to justify a quick sale at below market price. And I realized that Sandra and her boyfriend had probably already picked out the buyer, probably someone who was in on the scheme. The most devastating discovery was in the closing documents Jennifer had prepared. The proceeds from the sale weren't going to be split between me and Sandra, as I'd assumed. They were going directly into an account that Sandra had opened in her name only, using a fake document that claimed I'd signed over my rights to the house. It was a perfect crime, designed to leave me homeless and penniless while Sandra started her new life with my money. Jennifer had already called the police, and she'd also contacted the State Bar Association about potential legal malpractice by Sandra's attorneys, who had to have known that the documents were forged. As I sat there looking at the evidence of Sandra's crimes, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Not because I thought I could get my marriage back, but because I finally had proof that I wasn't the monster Sandra had made me out to be. The forged documents, the fake financial statements, the elaborate scheme to steal my house. It was all evidence that Sandra was the criminal, not me. Jennifer had already started the process of reporting the fraud to the authorities, and she'd also contacted a lawyer she knew who specialized in cases like mine. For the first time since I'd gotten that email at Mama's funeral, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely powerless after all. But I was about to discover that Sandra had one final surprise waiting for me, one that would change everything about how I saw our entire marriage. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Sandra's deception, and it turned out that I wasn't her first victim. She'd been married twice before, both times to military men, both times ending in divorce, where she'd walked away with substantial settlements. The pattern was always the same: marry a soldier, wait for deployment, empty the accounts, file for divorce with abuse allegations, then disappear with the money. Her current boyfriend wasn't just her lover, he was her partner in crime, a man with a criminal record who specialized in identity theft and financial fraud. They'd been running this scam for years, targeting military families because they knew we'd be vulnerable and isolated. The criminal charges came swift and severe. Sandra was arrested for fraud, forgery, and identity theft, while her boyfriend was charged as an accessory to multiple felonies. The military investigation cleared me of all charges, and I was reinstated with full honors and back pay. The civilian court reversed all of Sandra's temporary orders, and I was awarded full ownership of the house, along with damages for the emotional distress she'd caused. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was getting my life back, my reputation restored, and my faith in justice renewed. I still live in that house, though it feels different now, cleaner somehow. Like Sandra's lies and manipulation have been scrubbed away along with her presence. I've learned to appreciate the simple things: morning coffee without drama, phone calls that don't end in arguments, coming home to a place that actually feels like home. Mama would have been proud to see me fight back, to see me refuse to let Sandra destroy everything Daddy and I had worked for. Sometimes I still think about that email at the cemetery, and I realize that Sandra did me a favor. She showed me who she really was before I wasted any more years of my life on someone who never deserved my love. Now, as an old man sitting by the same window where Mama once sat, I finally understand why she burned those letters. Some betrayals don't need to be answered, just remembered. If this story reached your heart, then maybe it was worth telling after all. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt like giving up when everything seemed stacked against you, I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a comment, share your own story, or just let me know you were here. And if you want to stick around for more stories like this one, hit that subscribe button. I've got more to share about learning to rebuild when everything falls apart, and I think you might find some hope in what comes next.